Howard, you may want to kill your Slack notifications or Slack. Howard, we can still hear your Slack notifications. Maybe you want to mute.
Assume I don't need to press start webinar. I just leave that.
Yeah, I'm going to hit that right now.
Okay, thanks.
Good morning, everybody. How about that for an epic entrance? Good morning from Los Angeles. Good day wherever you may be. Yes, I do wear wool blazers at 6 a.m. in LA. I'm Josh Schrager. I'm a senior vice president at Caron. Super excited for our session today, and thank you all for being with us. Hamas's global support infrastructure remains resilient. They raise, they move, they transfer funds. And of course, as probably everyone on this call knows, that's despite years of pressure under international sanctions. Terrorist attacks cause little, but significant funds are needed for indoctrination, for recruitment, for training, for supplies, logistics, weapons, and beyond. Recently, as attention has shifted from ceasefire talks to reconstruction in the wake of the most recent Hamas-Israel conflict, governments, charities, and most certainly financial institutions must be vigilant that assistance does not benefit Hamas or other sanctioned terrorist groups. Over the next hour, we're going to discuss the state of Hamas's fundraising apparatus, and then we're going to get practical as we discuss the reality of investigating Hamas's global network, and specifically in the lens of compliance obligations. We have a great panel today. As I said, really excited and thrilled that we're able to do this. Today, we're joined by Simon Bucket, Director of Integrated Intelligence and Investigations at Standard Chartered Bank. Simon, good day. We have Matthew Levitt, Director of the Jeanette and Eli Reinhard Program on Counterterrorism and Intelligence. Sorry, Matt, it's a mouthful. At the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Thrilled to have you, Matt. We also have Howard Mendelson, Chief Client Officer at Caron, Mark Nakla, Executive Vice President of Research at Caron, and Zach Caldwell, Middle East and Terrorism Analyst at Caron. Quickly, we're off the record today. Please ask questions, chat module, chat box on Zoom. I know a bunch of folks are on YouTube, comment section. We'll get to your questions. And lastly, we'll make the session on demand in the next day or two. So with that, Howard, on to the show.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Josh. Great to be with everyone. As always, we do very much appreciate all of you joining us today. Program today, we've broken down into 3 sessions. First session, it's great to have Dr. Matt Levitt joining us. Matt's really spent an entire career studying, researching, writing, and teaching about these issues on terrorist financing. He's probably as well suited as anyone around to help sort of set the table for us with some historical context, as well as providing a bit of a strategic overview. For the second session, as Josh mentioned, we're going to shift into the insights, training, and tools. Frontline risk managers really do need to do the hard work of keeping funds relating to terrorist groups out of the financial system. Here, we're going to turn to Mark and Zach from our team. They're going to present some findings from research that they've been working on over the last couple of months. Very specifically, they'll go through a couple case studies that show with some pretty good detail how Hamas is continuing to raise and move funds to include using the exploitation use of the global financial system. Then for our last session today, which also should be highly valuable, we're going to bring in Simon from Standard Chartered. This should be particularly useful, especially from an investigative best practices perspective. Simon and his team working on a terrorist financing investigation involving Hamas. They brought us in to help track down some investigative leads. We're able to produce some pretty decent results, share those back. So look forward to hearing from Simon. He'll share some sort of upshots and outcomes from the investigation they did. And I should mention, we do very much value the opportunity to work with clients closely like that. So we have about an hour today. As Josh said, we do hope to get some questions too. So please sort of bring those forward. Matt, it's great to do a little work together again. Great to see you. Thanks for joining. Floor is yours.
Thanks so much, Howard. Thanks to everyone at Caron for putting this together. Simon, everybody, it's a pleasure to be able to participate in this event with you. Used to work at Treasury with a bunch of you guys, and it's a pleasure to be able to partner again. So I just think it's important to take a little bit of a historical look at Hamas and its financing, mostly because so much has changed that I fear that people are kind of laser focused on those changes and what's new, and not paying as much attention necessarily to the old and true, the types of financing transfer mechanisms that continue. Um, my book on Hamas came out in 2006, and that's basically the turning point. In January 2006, there's an election. Hamas does very well, wins the election. There's a national unity government. Over the course of that national unity government, by virtue of being part and parcel of the Palestinian government, Hamas was able to burrow itself within the government, within ministries, was able to move funds where it wanted them to go. It was able to create all kinds of front organizations. In 2007, when Hamas took over the Gaza Strip by force and the national unity government completely fell apart, a status that remains today with Fatah largely in control of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah and Hamas in control of the Gaza Strip. Shortly after that, I went to Ramallah and I met with the Ministry of Interior, and I met with the Ministry of Al-Qaf, the Ministry of Endowments, Islamic Endowments, and they walked me through the books that they were carefully going through, showing how Hamas, for example, in government was moving money to what they had listed as a jam factory. But when you went to the place, there was no jam factory at all. Or in another case, they were moving money to a business that they claimed was at a particular address, but at that address actually was a gymnasium where people were working out. It happened to be one apparently closely tied to Hamas, with posters of suicide bombers on the wall, etc. And so Hamas had been able to kind of burrow itself in government. With that split, and as they moved to the Gaza Strip, they lost that capability, but they gained other types of capabilities. They gained the ability to install a solidarity tax, to basically tax and license everything from the use of smuggling tunnels to running of cafes. Tunnels became the underground economy for the Gaza Strip. Hamas ran some tunnels, they taxed others. At some points, Hamas was getting most of the money that it needed to basically kind of run things by going to Iran and getting suitcases full of cash, literally suitcases full of $1, $2, or $3 million, and bringing them into the Gaza Strip through Egypt. I think it's important to remember that there were things that happened both domestically in terms of conflicts between Hamas and Gaza and Israel, and also things that happened more broadly. So you had the 2008, 2009, December, January conflict. You then had the Turkish flotilla in May 2010, which underscored not only the role of countries in the region, but the role of some charities tied to Hamas. The IHH charity in Turkey, for example, came up in very large ways in terms of the flotilla. But then perhaps the most important thing was the departure from Syria in 2012. It became very uncomfortable for Hamas, a Sunni organization, to remain headquartered, their external headquarters in Damascus, closely allied with the Syrian regime, which was partnering with Iran and Shia Hezbollah to target mostly Sunni Syrian civilians. And so Hamas left. They left for Egypt, which at the time had a Muslim Brotherhood-led government. They left for Lebanon. They left for Turkey in a big way, and some people went to Qatar. But then the Muslim Brotherhood-led government of Mohammed Morsi fell in 2013, and they lost that benefactor. And they kind of fell into a pretty big, significant crisis. Iran was still funding the military wing of Hamas, but the political wing, the ability to have money to run government, the ability to have money to run clinics and schools and hospitals, that was really hurt. Iran was very angry with them. They no longer had the ability to operate openly in Egypt. And then shortly thereafter to kind of say, hey, we're still here and we have some leverage, don't forget us. We had the July 2014 conflict. And those happened periodically, as we saw just a few weeks ago. Over time, as those conflicts happened, they typically ended with, well, how can money get into Gaza so that people can get by? And so that from the Israeli perspective, they could have an element of calm. And what began was the Qatar channel. And Qatar began to funnel millions of dollars to Hamas with the cognizance of the Israelis so that Hamas could run the Gaza Strip. Gaza wouldn't explode. There'd be some element of calm. That calculation seems to have changed with this recent conflict. We're going to have to see about that, but that could have a significant impact on how Hamas does its financing. We've also seen, though, that Hamas has tried to break out into other ways, and cryptocurrency has been a very sexy topic, and it has been one that Hamas has tried to use as well. With some success, it doesn't appear to be huge amounts of money. with some success. My concern is that we lose track of the fact that Hamas still uses and abuses charities, some that it actually runs, some that are just sympathetic with it, some that are not affiliated with Hamas at all, but really just want money to be able to go to the Gaza Strip so civilians there can live, but Hamas is able to exploit that in many, many different ways. And that Hamas still very much uses the international financial system, sometimes to bank, but often typically to facilitate transactions. Sometimes transactions through and including even designated or prescribed entities, and sometimes using cutouts or fronts to do that for them. And so I think it's a really timely conversation that Karen and Standard Charter have decided to have now, and to see some of the analysis that Karen's been able to put together to give us a better understanding of how Hamas is engaging in financial transactions through the formal financial system. I think it's important to note that even when such transactions run through the informal financial system, they typically have a touch point with banks. At a time when Iranian finance to Hamas has increased, where the US Treasury Department has revealed even Hamas's benefit from some of the very extravagant oil for terror plots that Iran and Hezbollah have come up with together, several of which have explicitly also intended to finance Hamas. How that money actually gets where it's intended to go will typically involve both informal and formal financial system touch points. So I'm thrilled to be able to give that introduction. I'm really excited to be able to partner with you all, and I look forward to seeing the analysis that you're able to share with us. Thank you.
Excellent, Matt. Hey, let me, if I could, just ask you to elaborate on one point, particularly with respect to sort of what's of interest, I think, and value to a lot of our audience today. When it comes to this question of, hey, how do you sort of identify where your exposure is to terrorist financing? You talked about the use of front companies and shell companies and various deceptive practices. On the one hand, sometimes you hear about, well, we really need, the government to sort of, do better at sharing information. Sometimes you'll hear, what are some topologies or patterns? And I think, I'll ask this question a little bit, with some slight prejudice that'll be obvious. And it's not to suggest that, public-private partnership isn't of value or that topologies can't be helpful. But can you just talk a little bit about, from your experience, the value of just simply understanding, what you possibly can about the background or interests or associations of the parties, I guess, to sort of doing this work?
So we're all products of our background and experience. Howard and I have both served as Deputy Assistant Secretary for Intelligence and Analysis at Treasury. So I think we come with that perspective, but I think it's very important. You're not going to be able to only look at, various government lists, HMT and OFAC, et cetera, and have all the answers you need. You're going to need to be able to do a little bit more digging. Some of that digging can even just be done by Google searches and the like. But of course, that will only go so far. It will only go skin deep. And so it's really useful. It's beneficial. It's protective for those who are engaged in trying to protect the financial system or a particular financial institution from abuse, to be able to have the ability to have insight into kind of what's happening behind closed doors. I don't mean, CIA, FBI type of activity. To the extent they can, make information public, that's always useful. But I mean the kind of work that Karen and other groups do that enables us to have a better understanding of what's happening simply by digging deep and drawing together the connections and then making those public. That's the type of typologies that are really useful. So we need to dig a little deeper. It's not as simple as just checking some lists. Government will never do that work for you, and there will never be a whitelist.
Yeah, very, very good. Well, thanks very much, Matt. Very much appreciate it. Hey, we're gonna, Mark, I think we'll bring you on here now and kick into our second session. So Mark, over to you.
Great, thanks, Howard, and thanks, Matt, for that really great introduction. I'll just kind of pick up where Matt Levitt left off. We here at Karen have conducted a number of research investigations on the fundraising networks of Hamas, both in Gaza and around the world in recent months. We've published some of that investigative research on the Karen Brief. The research is sort of timely, as Matt mentioned, in light of two sets of events. The first is, in the past year, European authorities have conducted a number of raids and closed a number of organizations in the EU with ties to Hamas. For example, late last year, the Austrian government conducted a raid on Hamas-affiliated organizations, including one specifically that was called the Palestinian Association in Austria, which is an organization that was sanctioned by the US government in the early 2000s. And then in May of this year, the German government, the Interior Ministry, banned an association for raising funds of Hamas. So that's sort of the first set of data or the first set of events that sort of triggered our investigation. And then second is the recent hostilities that Matt mentioned. And with the cessation of these hostilities, Hamas has turned to its aligned charities and entities abroad, including ones that are pre-existing in its network in Asia, in Europe, in the Middle East, to raise money to rearm its supply of weapons and rockets, and in part also to help or assist in repairing its image and fund the reconstruction of Gaza. And with that, international attention has sort of come down on Hamas with the added challenge of compliance with global sanctions and counter-terrorist financing measures to ensure that the money and the aid does not benefit Hamas or any other terrorist group for that matter. But this is a heavy undertaking, as many of you know, and it's a complicated task at that. And as Matt just mentioned, despite the years of pressure under US and international sanctions, Hamas really remains as capable and even as innovative as ever in raising and moving and in diverting funds. So enough of me. I want to jump right into a few case studies. Zach, you've been involved in some of that research into the ways in which Hamas has leveraged its networks abroad to access the global financial system, and some of the sanctions related exposure risks and typologies that are associated with those activities. And I know that you have two specific case studies from that research, so I'll hand it over to you and have you walk us through it.
Thanks, Mark. In the first case study, we'll explore how Hamas affiliated organizations in Malaysia have mobilized fundraising efforts following the recent hostilities in Gaza. In May, prior to the end of the conflict between Hamas and Israel, the Palestinian Cultural Organization Malaysia, otherwise known as PCOM, co-sponsored a virtual event alongside a number of other Malaysian charities and groups. The key featured speaker at the event was US-sanctioned Hamas leader and senior political bureau member, Musa Abu Marzouk. Here's an advertisement for the virtual event featuring Musa Abu Marzouk. PCOM is chaired by Muslim Imran, a Malaysia-based Hamas member who was named by Hamas in a press release as its representative in Malaysia. Other sponsors of the event included My Care Humanitarian Care and the Malaysia branch of Al-Quds Foundation International, which was sanctioned by the US government in 2014 for being, quote, controlled by and acting for or on behalf of Hamas, end quote. In his remarks, delivered in Arabic and translated into Malay, Marzouk encouraged participants to engage in jihad through financial aid and told the audience, "You are partners in this battle against Israel." The event solicited donations to an online fundraising campaign called Palestine Under Attack, which is organized by the Malaysian charity My Care. Donations for the fundraising campaign and for My Care are processed through his bank accounts, as well as a crowdfunding platform and a payment provider, both based in Malaysia. The fundraising campaign solicited funds with the message, "Let us rise up and defend the Palestinian land from Zionist invasion. Since the May 2021 virtual event, the Palestine Under Attack campaign, led by MyCare, has raised more than 1.4 million US in donations, according to MyCare's website. MyCare gained global attention in 2018 when MyCare activist Fadi al-Bach was killed by two unidentified gunmen on a motorcycle in Kuala Lumpur. Fadi al-Bach, a Gaza-born lecturer at University Kuala Lumpur, was described in media reporting as a technology expert for the Izzeldin al-Qassam brigades, Hamas's military wing. Some of these organizations we discussed here, including Al-Quds Foundation Malaysia and MyCare, advertise and solicit donations through bank accounts at major Malaysian financial institutions.
So it's a fascinating example, and it never ceases to amaze, the more you look at it. At first look, some of these organizations may not really have direct ties to Hamas, but an investigation showed links to Hamas really through a number of ways, including, for example, leadership, and in one case, a virtual event that featured a key sanctioned Hamas facilitator and Hamas leader. And the fundraising campaigns are calling for donations indirectly to Hamas through these organizations from thousands of miles away, using both bank accounts, using, as you mentioned, payment providers. So even if these charities and organizations involved are not a client, you could still see some exposure here. Some of the Malaysian banks, for example, could present some exposure through correspondent banking relationships. So it's a great example, Howard. I don't know if you have any thoughts as well on this.
Yeah, it really good example, and those are good insights. One point to possibly, either you or Zach could possibly elaborate on a little bit more. Is this a typology just sort of, reflective of what's happening in Malaysia, or do you see sort of circumstances along these lines, in other countries and other jurisdictions, sort of globally, I guess?
So it's hard sort of to boil the ocean in a 60-minute presentation. We certainly have a number of examples. The typology here is very clear in that you have these organizations not outwardly by first look tied to Hamas, but the more you look and the more you investigate, you see ties to Hamas, whether it's through, as we mentioned with, in this case, for example, Muslim Imran, who is in other reporting mentioned as Hamas's on-the-ground representative in Malaysia, or you see it through these events. So, in the course of what we do, we look at these events, who's hosting, what they're saying, as Zach sort of pointed out, and all of these points together just sort of present this kind of typology that we're showing, which are Hamas affiliated or Hamas tied groups outside of Gaza, thousands of miles away, with access to the financial system, that are raising funds through these fundraising campaigns, taking advantage of events in Gaza to continue their activities and to raise funds. So it's certainly a broader typology beyond just this one example, for sure.
Very good.
Great. Zach, do you have another example?
Yes. Yeah, moving on. In this next case study, we're going to look into an example of how Hamas has set up front companies outside of Gaza to raise funds in circumvention of US and global sanctions. In this example, we'll start with an organization actually based in Gaza, the Palestinian Zakat Institution in Gaza, which is led by senior Hamas figures, including US-sanctioned Hamas leader Marwan Mohammed Abu Ras and Abdul Rahman Tamraz, a former right-hand man of deceased Hamas founder Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. During the May 2021 conflict, the Palestinian Zakat Institution established the Emergency Relief Campaign, which pledged to provide affected families with food and emergency housing. On social media, the Palestinian Zakat Institution solicited donations to the fundraising campaign in euro, US dollar, and Turkish lira donations through accounts at a Turkish bank in Istanbul. as you see here in this image. The Palestinian Zakat Institution, in its social media post, noted that the accounts were held by a company called Akhtar Yonetem Hizmetlari Limited Şirketi, which was set up in February 2021 and is registered in the Turkish Trade Registry and the Chamber of Commerce. Akhtar reports in its corporate filing and on its website that it's involved in a variety of business activities, including the import and export of goods, real estate, travel, and translation services, among others. The manager and sole shareholder of Akhtar Yonetem Hizmetlari, Hazem Al-Ayashi, was a registrant for a domain of Al-Quds TV's website, a Hamas-run media outlet that broadcasts on several Arab satellites from Lebanon.
So another great example, I think this sort of touches on something that Matt talked about in the introduction, during his trip to Gaza, where he met with Palestinian officials, and the conversation about Hamas setting up these seemingly legitimate businesses as fronts. This is another one of these examples, and it's different than the example we showed earlier, where we start here with an organization that's based in Gaza, and it's led by senior Hamas leaders and Hamas members, including one in this case that is sanctioned on the US government list, and another who is sort of a well-known right-hand man of Hamas's founder, Sheikh Ahmed Yassin. And the solicitation for donations here, they established a fundraising campaign, raising funds on social media. But here they advertise clearly that they're accepting donations through a seemingly legitimate LLC, a company that has a website that says that they do legitimate business and is registered in the corporate records in Turkey. And through that solicitation on social media, they have bank accounts soliciting donations in euros, US dollars, and Turkish lira, as Zach mentioned, through an account at a large Turkish financial institution here. So it's another example of the typology that Matt was talking about in terms of setting front companies with seemingly legitimate businesses. And the more you sort of dig into it, the ties back to Hamas and to the networks of Hamas is very clear and very fascinating. Howard, any thoughts?
No, I think that's pretty good summation.
Okay. So I think those are sort of all the examples we have. Howard, I'll hand it back to you.
Okay, very good. Well, thanks, Mark, and thanks, Zach. Very, very clear and very interesting examples there. Simon, if we could sort of bring you on now, and we'll get into our third session here. I think we've got some slides probably we can put up. Okay, very good, Simon. Well, thanks for joining us, and we'll sort of hand it to you to take it away here a little bit. Appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Howard. Thanks, guys. Really interesting to see the work that had been going on in the background before I made the phone call to you a couple of months ago. So from a Standard Chartered perspective, so my role within financial crime compliance is to investigate some of our key and major cases that come in. You'll all be aware of the different ways that those can come in, whether it's an internal event or media or law enforcement. In this particular case, we had some external intelligence come to us, matching a lot of what we've just heard, that there is a charity called Interpal who are sanctioned in a number of countries for their funding of Hamas. And the external intelligence that we received was that they're actually circumventing these sanctions by using various other UK charities. And we were given a list of 4 other charities to look at, saying that they're funding the monies both through fundraising and then channeling it out to various places around the world, specifically in Gaza. when we started this, our initial concerns obviously are this is very UK based. Standard Chartered have a footprint all across the world. While we are headquartered in the UK, our UK footprint isn't huge. However, anything that hits UK and hits us does concern us greatly. Our footprint that is so wide leads us to having to being open to inherent risks, which are that we have a presence in significant high risk jurisdictions, and hence why we invest so heavily in FCC. However, with the particular concerns that were forwarded to us, we were, for want of better words, slightly struggling with our research into not so much the charities, but what the wider issues were here. Who was controlling these charities? What were they linked to? Where were they linked to? Where did they come from? How long have they been in existence? The classic questions you'd ask. I'm pleased to say that Standard Chartered and specifically FCC have a very good relationship with Caron, and we do a lot of work with them. And that's a relationship that's been going on for quite some time. So very easy to pick up the phone to Howard and say we could do some help here. Which was when the guys came in a very short amount of time, and obviously it seems that at the same time they've been doing their own research that you've just seen, and then plugged in what we'd given them to give us how this network really was put together. And I think we've got some. I'm right in saying we've got a few charts of what came out of that.
Sure. Yeah. So I can sort of. Do you want to talk to this slide, Simon, and I can jump in after you?
Yes. Yeah. Let me do that first. So, Mark will bring up the slides in a minute that we got produced. It's a bit of a whistle stop, and it's a bit of an overview as opposed to the entirety of the information provided, because the entirety of the information provided was quite substantial, and huge for our investigation. And the key risks will be unsurprising to a lot on this call that we're looking at. Do we have any direct exposure? Do we have any indirect exposure? Do we have any correspondent banking exposure? I think let's go into the charts, and then I'll speak a little bit further on what we found out.
If we can go to the next slide, just very briefly. So, I'll pick up sort of where you left off. So we received the inquiry related to the 4 charities in the UK. And so, we sort of embarked on our usual process, and we were asked to sort of look for publicly available information to ascertain a relationship with Interpal and or Hamas. And I say publicly available information because all of the information that we just showed, but also the ones we provided, it's based on publicly available information. So for our investigation, for example, we used a diverse set of publicly available sources to include corporate records, charity commission records, the annual reports of the relevant charities. We looked into social media, both social media accounts and postings, news and media coverage as well, in addition to property records, as you'll see in one of the charts I'll show. And in the course of our investigation and the network analysis, we looked for, and in fact, we were actually able to identify 3 key typologies that connect the 4 named charities into the network of Hamas Interpal. And these three key typologies are first common leadership or interlocking management among and between the different organizations. Second typology, we looked into common identifiers, whether, for example, some of these organizations share headquarters or share operational branches or other sort of identifiers such as phone numbers. And then third, we looked into the financing or funding of projects, whether directly or even indirectly between these different organizations through third-party partners on the ground. And in the course of our research investigation and in conducting the network analysis, we were able to provide additional information to assist in the investigation, to include, for example, where we started with 4 entities and Interpal, we provided an additional 200 leaders or senior managers of the organizations and their partners, and this is all to assist in the investigation. We also provided more than 180 identifiers to include shared addresses and phone numbers. And through the network analysis, we were able to identify more than 50 additional partner organizations or affiliates that have received funding or received support from Interpal or the four named charities. And so while we don't have the time, unfortunately, to go through all of the data, I want to give just a very brief overview, if you don't mind, Simon, of what these typologies look like.
Yeah, absolutely.
So we'll pull up the first chart. First, we'll look at the common leadership and management typology. And so here we'll start with the London-based Education Aid for Palestinians, a UK registered charity that's focused on higher education programming and development in the Gaza Strip. In the mid-2000s, just by way of background, this organization was also a member of the Union of Good, which is and remains a US-sanctioned Hamas front, alongside Interpal and other UK and EU-based organizations. Now, in this chart that you see in front of you, Interpal's founder and trustee, Assam Yusuf Mustafa, was also reported in Charity Commission records to have been involved in establishing and in serving as a trustee of this named organization. And according to Education Aid for Palestinians filing with the UK Charity Commission, another individual named Zahir Khalid Barawi is a trustee of the organization. In 2013, Israel's Minister of Defense actually designated Barawi as a member of a Hamas organization and affiliated, quote, with Hamas today. So that's the common leadership and management. The second typology we sort of looked at was common identifiers. And one of the interesting sanctions-related typologies we see is the use of shared locations, addresses, and their identifiers, including enhanced identifiers that are not listed in sanctions or enforcement announcements. And so in this investigation, we looked at the current and the past addresses of both Interpal and the organizations that were in the inquiry. So I'll pivot briefly to one of these examples here, and we'll start with an address of IF Charity at 29 Henley Street in Birmingham. And according to its Charity Commission records, IF is based at Unit 1 of 29 Henley Street. This is a small two-level commercial building in southeastern Birmingham. We'll go back to the chart. Our review of Interpal's current and archived web pages lists its Birmingham office as being based at 334 Ladypool Road in Birmingham. And this is the only listed address for Interpal's Birmingham branch since at least 2014. However, when we looked at the street view captures of 29 Henley Street, we saw that Interpal's Birmingham branch had, as of at least March 2019, maintained an office at the same location. And Interpal's presence at this 29 Henley Street address goes as far back as 2015. Prior to being based at both addresses, Interpal's Birmingham branch was based at another location, at Unit 5 of the Bordsley Center in Birmingham. The Bordsley Center is actually the address of a third organization known as the Muaf Trust. And the Muaf Trust has hosted Interpal events and worked with the sanctioned charity on a number of projects. Now, the Muaf Trust actually reports that it leases out units in this Bordsley Center to organization at, quote, competitive rates to better help them and better enable them carry out their operations. The third typology we sort of looked at here is that of financing or funding of projects through partners. And in our investigation, we looked into projects of the charities that may tie to Hamas and Interpal. So let me walk you briefly through just one of these examples. In 2017, one of the UK-based organizations, Education Aid for Palestinians, reported in its annual returns that it actually signed a memorandum of understanding with Interpal. And according to that report, the MOU with Interpal allow both parties to, quote, collaborate in humanitarian relief and development project and exchange information and cooperation. Now, in the same report, EAP reported that it had received a £764,000 grant from Interpal, which represented a significant increase from the previous year's grant from Interpal. Now, separate of that, in 2016 and 2019, the UK-based organization EAP financed projects of a Gaza-based entity known as AMR for Development and Rehabilitation Association. And this is according to social media posts and Palestinian media reports as well. And you see here one of these social media posts. What's interesting here is that according to AMR's website, the organization that's based in Gaza, they feature Interpal as one of their partners. However, nowhere do they talk about EAP, the other UK-based organization, as one of their partners. Simon, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Mark. Apologies, I think my video had a bit of a funny turn there, but it's come back. Yeah, really interesting to see what was provided there. From a Standard Charter point of view, we had these allegations, but we didn't have an awful lot of substance behind them. We've got someone saying these charities are connected to Interpal, and you should take this as read. For a large international bank, that's a very difficult thing to take on the surface of things. Then when we see this intel that's coming from Caron, everything from looking into the insights of the addresses, what we've got in the windows in Birmingham, things like that, was absolutely huge for us. It means that we can then go and investigate. And when we're finding exposure, it's actually relevant, which makes a huge difference to us, obviously. And talking through some of those charts that you saw, in the leadership and management was a huge one for us, and it sprawls on a little more than Mark's actually said. He's being modest. But we've, as you can see from the slides in front of you, we found a lot of exposure, nearly $2 million that had gone through names that were on these charts, but also that matched the allegations we were talking about. So lots of donations and funds moving through with individuals and entities that are talking about for education, for schooling, and through Zakat committees as well. While on the surface of things, you might think, oh, is that a problem? When you match it up with all the intelligence that we've received, really made a big difference, and things that we're now looking into further. Same with, there's a lot of detail in the Caron product that talks about alleged Hamas financiers, and not just alleged. Actually, when you look into the intelligence, this is pretty solid. And when you think about, Hamas may not be sanctioned in every country in the world, but they are sanctioned by the US, the UK, and in that respect, then whatever currency, wherever we're moving it, we need to be aware of it, and we need to report it as necessary. Talking of high-risk jurisdictions, the classics are coming up that we're concerned about. A lot of Middle Eastern countries, Turkey come up quite a lot. Saudi Arabia comes up quite a lot as sources of funds, and sometimes beneficiary countries as well. We also started seeing the leadership management tabs, charts, things starting to move between. So we're starting to see interactions between other subjects on our running list. So whereas Mark said absolutely there was hundreds of names and entities that came in to start with, we then narrowed that down to, okay, what's the riskiest for us? We'll cross-reference with things like our watch list, we'll cross-reference with sanctions lists and things that we can narrow down. Then we've got a core list, and I think for us, we're about 40 or 50 as a core list. We started to see money pinging between all of them, especially between the leadership and management. which is in part fascinating to see and in part absolutely frightening to see, because it's things that we see as an investigation function as our value adds. You know, a transaction monitoring alert will not pick up on this if it's not something that's in a system. And knowing about the intelligence behind Hamas financiers is not going to be in that system if it's allegations, even if it's strong allegations, until someone might be sanctioned or watch list. Moving on to the identifiers chart, also very interesting, but we saw a lot less exposure here. Same again with the high risk jurisdictions. I have to apologize. I believe Amazon has just appeared at my house. With the high risk jurisdictions, very, very similar. The organizations started creeping up. We did see some additional connections to Hezbollah, which then brought up some more risks, obviously, for us, and then crossover with other investigations. Interestingly, if you can flip to the next slide with what I've called projects 1 and 2, which we saw where everything was starting to link together, and how the management and others would then start using this to really fundraise. This is where, again, we started to see a lot of money coming up, you know, apart from with the management, who clearly were getting a lot of money in for themselves. We saw a good $250,000 here. And I've put this all in equivalent dollars. And a lot of the currencies we're seeing is GB sterling, which is obvious because they're UK charities, but then US dollars and euros. So a typical thing we're seeing quite a lot of recently to try and avoid the US dollars, to avoid those sanctions, to go through euros and sterling as well. Again, huge amount of transactions that were very, very consistent with the external intelligence, both what we've received in the initial piece of intelligence and then what Caron are giving us as well. You know, these are not coincidences. These are starting to become factual. We're then starting again to see counterparties transacting with each other. You know, different subjects from different charts that Caron provided, like, oh, there's one here, and one here. Again, I mean, you're seeing repeated things here and the involvement of high risk jurisdiction. And then as we got to getting through this, and I'll preface, it's a live investigation. It's still ongoing. We are seeing the consistent use of one particular correspondent bank, based in both, headquartered in the Middle East, but with a huge UK presence. And it's been coming up again and again and again. And there is further work to be done into that. But it's starting to become a classic case of here we found some avenues, we found some routes that work where this money can go in, be it through charities, be it through education facilities. The great example of something that Caron found was there is a hospital in Gaza that has essentially been hijacked by Hamas, and they'll do a lot of ordering of medical supplies through there, but it's not for medical supplies. It's the process of getting either money into the country or buying things that they're not actually saying they're buying. So everything that's coming up, and then those corridors and avenues of getting the money around the world have been very consistent. And it's still an ongoing investigation. If we go to the next slide, you know, our next steps are we've found this network that Caron have put together. Now we're looking at it from our banking perspective and our transactional perspective, and building up yet more networks because we've seen the networks that Caron have put together. Then I see money going from A to B to C. Okay, let's look into those and see where else things are going. And I suspect at some point we'll have a debrief with Caron to help them out in that respect. And then it's looking at the correspondent banking avenues that are being used. And the classic that everyone who works in the bank or has done on this call will hear is about filing in the right jurisdictions to the right people and having the right discussions with law enforcement so that any of this activity can be either stopped or certainly greatly reduced. I think that is an absolute whistle-stop tour on our investigation and how it went from 5 names on a bit of paper, almost literally, to a really worthwhile investigation that's obviously got a lot of eyes on it across the bank and certainly from Caron as well, because because they've done a great job of helping us out in this one.
Well, Simon, thanks very much. I mean, I think it's just a really super interesting set of circumstances and facts and analysis. So we do really appreciate your willingness and interest in sharing sort of, you know, your insights here and the results of this investigation. And the big sort of strategic takeaway for me, you know, and having been around these issues for so many years is you know, I remember, you know, a lot of discussion, debate about, you know, what's the utility of using sanctions on these terrorist groups. It drives them further underground. They're going to still move money, but they're going to move away from the financial system. You're going to lose visibility. They're going to go dark. It's still going to happen. Like, you know, it doesn't make sense to, you know, expose, you know, these organizations using sanctions. And I think, you know, we're now, you know, post 20 years from 9/11, you know, 15 years from when, you know, you had some of these debates, going on, inside governments, across governments. I mean, these were international discussions that you know were happening, and you know what we see here. I don't think it's limited to Hamas. I think you could you know look at all, you know, many different organizations and come up with similar kind of, you know, instances where they're using these different organizations that on their face aren't you know, don't appear to be, you know, supporting terrorist groups, but that's exactly what they're doing. And just the extent to which you've got exposure, you know, in the financial system. Obviously, you're one institution, right? You know, how you know, this isn't, you know, unique or germane only for you. You know, certainly you're you know, being super proactive and going after it. But for all those on here, hopefully some valuable insights to think about, you know, how to go about, you know, attacking, you know, whether it's Hamas or any other terrorist groups, you know, these kinds of challenges and problems. Josh, let me kick it over to you. I think we do have some questions that have come in.
Thanks, Howard. Thanks, everyone. Really interesting insight. I mean, look, as we always say, we could go on for hours on this. And I know, Simon, when you said it's a whistle stop version, it's, yeah, you know, it really, that's the heart of the matter. Let me dive quickly into some questions over the next 7 minutes. There was a question specifically about the reference we had to moving money through a hospital in Gaza. And there was a curiosity that said, if we have more information, more details on how they are utilizing that hospital, if they're, you know, ordering medical supplies from a company and overpaying, or, you know, if there's typologies you can share specifically there.
Yeah, I'll start on that one, and then Mark, you'll probably correct me. A lot of what we're seeing comes through transaction references. So you know, it's not direct clients. This is correspondent banking. So we're looking at the underlying clients here. So a lot of what we're seeing, it looks like it is medical supplies for a hospital. But as I understand it, it is the mixture of the two. It is overpaying, so you're laundering the money through. But it's also just a completely fake invoice. You know, it says it's for it's a box of medical supplies, so it can get into the country, and there's no medical supplies in the box. It is whatever they want it to be. That is what I understand it. Howard's nodding at me, so it looks like I've read his report correctly.
Mark, do you have anything else, or Howard? Mark, anything else to add on to that?
No, I mean, that absolutely makes sense. You know, the other thing is, I think of it in terms of the supply chain of the hospital. So it's everything from the building of the hospital and raising funds to build the hospital, to the running of the hospital, to the medical supplies, and then continuing to, you know, to use the hospital. There have been examples where the Israelis have targeted specific hospitals or buildings near hospitals because, you know, they're hosting or they're sort of storing rockets or military equipment there. So it's a fascinating story. The exposure kind of really comes in different ways. Howard, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I don't, Mark. That's nothing on this, nothing further here.
All right, we'll do a bit of a lightning round. So let me take a step back for Matt. You know, and as we've talked about, kind of the details for a while, which are fascinating and important. You know, at the end of the day, if, you know, someone wants to legitimately give money to, you know, reconstruction in Gaza, can they do so? How would they do so, you know, without, risking, right, that such funds would, end up in Hamas? Are there legitimate avenues to do so?
I love that question. And the answer is, of course, there are. And the takeaway should not be that providing support to needy Palestinians is in any way a bad thing. To the contrary. But we do need to do our due diligence when we are dealing with conflict zones and risky jurisdictions. And by virtue of the Gaza Strip being run by a designated terrorist organization, that is a risky jurisdiction. So whether it's through international organizations that work with the UN or otherwise, there's a lot that can be done. There are plenty of ways to give money in the context of the Gaza Strip. We're talking about a small sliver of the activities. You do want to avoid things that go through the Hamas government because of the Hamas government's ability to manipulate its ministries, to manipulate industry, to manipulate hospitals, to engage in not only kind of broad deceptive financial practices, but black on white money laundering, trade-based money laundering. And so you do need to do a little due diligence, as I would argue people should do whenever they're giving charitably, and I hope everyone is, to people in need. When you do so in conflict zones, that requires a little bit more personal institutional due diligence.
Thanks, Matt. Yeah, look, I think important points for everyone, and look, in the context of compliance officials, that most of the people in the line are thinking about compliance, understanding that there are plenty of avenues that would work. Coming back to the data, and I know that in some of the case studies we showed, everything was based on open source data, right? Which is the bread and butter of Karen. And looking at social media, which I know came up a couple of examples, the Google Maps, which I think was a fascinating use of that open source tool. Mark or Zach, how much do you rely on social media or Google Maps, vis-a-vis other sorts of sources, and when's like the appropriate time that you would think to, or an analyst who's on the line would think to turn to those sources as to maybe more traditional sources?
So I'll start and then hand it over to Zach. What we do and everything that you saw today, as you mentioned, Josh, is based on publicly available, publicly knowable information. That comes in a variety of different ways. Certainly, social media is a key component of that, considering the network that we're looking at here. But different terrorist networks use different means, and so we don't just rely on one social media platform or the other. We don't only just rely on social media, but we complement the information we glean from social media with additional primary source information to include, for example, corporate records, charity records. We look at the websites of the different charities or the organizations that are flagged or that we're looking into. We look into the leadership to try to identify their networks of affiliations and activities. But I would say that, in the current day and age, social media is definitely a rich information environment. These groups and groups like Hamas and others, they don't operate in isolation. They operate based on a very broad network of supporters and affiliates. And so social media and even the internet is just sort of a way to reach a much broader audience in a very quick way. So it's definitely important, but I would say it's not the only source of relevant and important information.
Thanks, Mark. Yeah, look, always a holistic approach, right? I mean, and it's there is, I think, no shortcut, as we know from what our teams of analysts and do day to day, day in and day out at Caron. There's no shortcut for rolling up your sleeves and connecting all the dots across all the myriad of sources that are available, and that and that is it takes time, but certainly we see that doing that pays the rewards, if you will, of fully understanding or better understanding these networks. Let me do. I know we're running up on the hour. Let me do one last question. I'm going to kick over to Howard. Howard, should a financial institution block funds if there is evidence that a non-listed charity is raising funds for a terrorist group, or or how should you think about that or approach that from a compliance vantage point?
No, it's an interesting question. Simon, I don't know if you want to, weigh in here as well. My own take would be, number one, this is a legal question. We're not practicing attorneys. So number one, big part of the challenge, can you identify that instance first and foremost? Obviously, that's our role. Obviously, you're going to want to get legal involved. You're going to want to pay attention to, expectations, in your local jurisdiction. The only thing I would share, from an OFAC perspective, with some experience there, we always think of like, oh, if it's not on the list, it's not illegal. Of course, that's not true. There's a 50% rule, but even beyond the 50% rule, if you've got evidence to show that there's an interest of a terrorist group in a transaction, I think there is an argument to be made, and of course, consult with your attorneys that there's, a terrorist group's interest in that property, a sanctioned interest in that property, and you'd want to, seriously consider the block there. There's also, options with rejecting, of course, or reporting otherwise a suspicious activity. Simon, welcome your thoughts here as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much mirrored. Those on the call who work for banks and have done this before will know the idea will be to act in caution.
I think the police.
Apologies, it's 30 degrees.
Simon, are they coming
so
for you?
Are open.
I don't think it's damn hot anymore.
Yeah, we are at the end of the pandemic, and working from home will become not the norm soon, I hope. No, I think we will always act in caution. We always know we have a huge US, maybe not presence, but we act in US dollars a lot. You have to understand, obviously, that the US regulator is a lot more cautious than others. Or maybe they're a little bit more overzealous than others, which makes us a bit more cautious. It's no secret, everybody knows it. But that has knock-ons around the world, right? And I think we do absolutely err on the side of caution. If I've got intelligence from Caron, intelligence from other sources, and my transactions that is matching and is consistent to allegations, that is enough suspicion to say, let's file. I mean, it is a suspicious activity report, a suspicious transaction report in the end. Sometimes we'll get feedback saying you've too cautious. Rarely, but I think it is. If you've got 2 or 3 pieces of intel matching transactions that you're seeing, activity that you're seeing, CDD documentations that you're seeing, then it is exactly what it is. It goes into the regulator. It goes into law enforcement, and it's the law enforcement that's the key one. Here in the UK, we have the Joint Money Laundering Task Force, and that is the way you get it to other banks. Howard, you touched on it a tiny bit earlier, but like it's always the challenge here. It's like, if I'm seeing all of this, I'm not the only person. No chance, no way, no how. Not unless they're an incredibly bad money launderer or financial criminal. And it's the age-old discussion, especially here in the UK. How do we make sure we're talking to the right people? Now, at the moment, I report it into the National Crime Agency, and they'll filter it out through the GIMLA to the other banks, but it's incredibly inefficient. There is supposed to be a way, and this is on a completely different webinar topic of SAR reform, where I should be able to stop, go and talk to other banks. We'll get everything, all our ducks in a row, and file it as a super SAR or whatever they want to call it. Today, it seems to change the name every day. And that's the next bit that needs working on, right? Because this is a classic case for it. This is where I should be going out independent or without the need for law enforcement, going and talking to the other financial institutions and taking it on from there. But as I say, that's the topic for another time, for another day, and probably with the lawyers.
Well, look, if I may say so myself, look, part of the reason why we host these events is so to try to, particularly in a virtual world, facilitate some of those conversations. So obviously, I know, all of the folks on from financial institutions from UK, Europe, US, Middle East, and beyond today certainly had a lot to learn, Simon, from, hearing about, what your approach has been, hearing about your investigation And of course, hearing from Dr. Matthew Levitt and the rest of the Caron team here. So with that, I'm looking at the watch. I know we're a couple minutes over. There are more questions that we've not gotten to. As I will always say, drop us a line, webinars@caron.com. If you send an email there, we'll get your question over to whoever is relevant. If it's a member of the Caron team, if it's Matt, if it's Simon. Happy to continue to facilitate those conversations. We look at 60 minutes as being a starting point to get into topics that I know we've all been covering for decades and decades of our lives, and we'll all continue to cover. So by all means, we're happy to continue those conversations offline. With that, Matt, thank you so much. Simon, great to have you. The Caron team, thank you all for your hard work. As I said, this session will be made available in the next couple of days, and we'll look forward to having more conversations. They won't be ending. The issues aren't going away. So we'll certainly have many more conversations in the months and years to come. So thanks again to everyone for being on. Stay well, stay healthy, and we'll see you soon.